Welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. This is a daily podcast that's going through the key chapters of God's Word.
Was it Yogi Berra who said, when you see a fork in the road, pick it up? Maybe it was, but I'm not really sure that's good advice for pretty much anything, especially when making decisions. Challenge is, life is full of decisions, and a wise person learns the ways of walking with God down the road of life so that when we do come to forks in the road, we have a pretty good idea of which way to go. Today we're turning to Proverbs chapter 16, which is one of my favorite go-to chapters to pray through when I'm facing difficult decisions. And looking forward to going through this chapter together with you just to see all of the riches that God has given to us about how to make good and wise decisions in life. Well, this is our third study in the book of Proverbs, and as we've been easing into this book, we've explained that these Proverbs have been given so that we learn this skill of living according to God's instruction. In chapter 1, we explained that Proverbs are gnomic literature. They tell us the way things go. And one of the keys to wisdom is learning to understand how God has designed life to operate. You see, the wise person tries to understand God's principles and align their lives according to His design. Now, the foolish person, they try to live in the exceptions. They hope that they can somehow skirt God's design and set their own course of life. But as we work through this chapter, we will see that that's not the way of wisdom, and often even that kind of mindset stems from pride, which is ultimately a wisdom killer. Now, hopefully at this point, you've already read chapter 16. You might have sensed that this chapter has a theme to it. On the one hand, all of these proverbs can just stand alone and just provide great wisdom for life. But on the other hand, they dovetail together beautifully to give us just a clear understanding of how to make wise decisions. Even when I was preparing for this podcast, I read through this chapter a few times, and I began to put each verse under a specific heading, headings like guidance, or pride and humility, or godly living, or wisdom with words, or wisdom with living, or slander and strife. And this can just be a helpful way of working through the book of Proverbs in general, because as you begin to group them under certain headings, you can see what God has said about specific topics. And as we follow that method for chapter 16, we're going to see that it just gives us clarity about how to make wise and godly decisions. And one of the things I love about this chapter is it helps us keep a right balance when it does come to decision making. Often when we talk about making decisions, and we talk about wanting to make sure that we're doing what is pleasing to God. Now, that is totally appropriate because we need to push back against the natural tendency of our own will that we just make ourselves king and we just do whatever we want. Lots of people, even churchgoers, will sometimes follow their own path and not really submit it to the Lord, not really let Him lead Him, and they end up just doing their own thing. That's not good. And so we have to resist that natural tendency to do our own thing. We just need to get to that place where we were like Jesus. Remember when He was in the Garden of Gethsemane and He just said to the Lord, "Not my will, but thy will be done"? That's the kind of place we need to get to. That's the kind of attitude we need to get to. But here's the challenge. Sometimes people get paralyzed when it comes to making decisions, and they're afraid of doing something that would not be God's will, and they end up doing nothing. We sometimes call that decision paralysis. When we get to that decision paralysis, Proverbs 16 provides a great balance on how to make good, godly, wise decisions. Because even when God doesn't give us clear black and white indications of what is His will, He still expects us to live a wise life in obedience to Him. And often the irony is that when we are just in that decision paralysis, that inaction is really stemming from fear. And we are fearful because we're afraid of making the wrong decision, but that fear actually shows us that we are operating from what really is a lack of faith, because we're saying that we believe the outcome of our decision is up to us. But it's not really. If you look down at verse 1, it says, "The plans of the heart belong to man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord." Or down to verse 9, it says, "The mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps." Now, the point of these verses is that we may have made the decision, but God determines the outcome. And God will gladly and frequently step in such a way that He directs us to an outcome that we may not have been expecting, but is still according to His plan. That's how we can look in the rearview mirror of life and see that straight path of the Lord where, God was guiding this whole thing all along. And if it's not straight, well, that just may show us that we weren't submitting to God very much during that season of life. So when we know this principle, it can release a lot of pressure from us because it shows us we can trust God. God is not going to allow our foot to slip. It's easier to steer a car that's moving, and if we're seeking to honor God and obey His word, and if we're seeking to be surrendered to Him and inviting His intervention, He will step in and He will work in that situation in a way that accomplishes His will. So that's already a key principle from this chapter, but there are many more in chapter 16. And so let's just start digging into this chapter and just seeing how to make wise decisions. Let's talk about just even how hunger is good, for instance. See, we've already established that maybe we're making decisions and the outcome belongs to the Lord. Let's now drop all the way down to verse 26 and see what it says about hunger and how God will use hunger to guide us. It says, a worker's appetite works for him, for his hunger urges him on. And this principle is rooted in the fact that many of our decisions stem from a need in life. For instance, we might need to make money to put a roof over our heads and food on the table, or we might need a car to get to work. And so that need there is a tool in the hand of God to lead us to a place of action, and that action is helping accomplish God's will for our life. Now, sometimes we might be discouraged by these needs. We might say, well, man, my situation is so difficult right now. But if we view that situation biblically, God has sovereignly allowed those needs to exist in our life, and often those needs are the very thing that He is using to spurring us on to action. We need food, so we work hard. We work hard, we end up glorifying God. We're looking for friends, so we reach out to someone at work, and we end up blessing them and ministering to them in the name of Christ. Those needs end up helping us accomplish God's will. And so those needs aren't bad. They're often God's tools in our life to guide us and lead us to a path that just further fulfills His word. Now, along those lines, as we're looking to solve the needs of life and make decisions, we have to be people of prayer who are constantly submitting those needs to the Lord, those paths to the Lord, and asking Him to purify us so that what we're doing is for the Lord and not for ourselves. And the way we make sure we're doing this is by seeking to be righteous, down to the very details that no one may even know about in our life. Look at verse 11. Verse 11 says, a just balance and scales belong to the Lord. All the weights of the bag are His concern. And now, on the one hand, this verse is saying that we shouldn't cheat people. That's just a great principle in general. God's will and God's provision never requires us to cheat people or be dishonest. But verse 11 also says, all the weights of the bag are His concern. All of the weights. Now, when you think about what this is, back in those ancient days, they'd have those ancient scales with those two dishes that would be balanced on either side, and you would put a hunk of metal or a hunk of rock on one side. That was the weight, and then you would balance that out with a piece of like meat or grain or something, and when they got balanced and level, you knew how much that meat would weigh or the grain would weigh or something like that. But here's the thing. You could take those weights and just mislabel them. Maybe it wasn't really 12 ounces. Maybe it was really 11 ounces. Or maybe it wasn't 5 ounces. It was really 4 ounces. And you could cheat people in a way that they would never know because they would never be able to just check those weights. Well, God was not cool with that. He was never okay with people cheating others. And here we're seeing that all of the weights matter to God. Not just the big ones, not the heavy ones, but just going through all of those weights and shaving off a little here. All of that is against God's will for our life. And a part of making good decisions is just being righteous and seeking God to bring righteousness into every detail so that He is glorified through and through. And so that's what we see in verse 8. Better is a little with righteousness than great income with injustice. Or in verse 17, the high way of the upright is to depart from evil. He who watches his way preserves his life. And so when we give attention to the righteousness of our life, we'll be following God's will. He'll never call us to sin, and He'll never be pleased when we're in a state of sin or cheating others or anything like that. Another thing we need to learn is that we need to let the Lord provide clarification if we're making a bad decision or pursuing the wrong path. You see, as we're just going through these decisions we have to make, we might be doing something and not realizing that we're now heading towards a path that's going to end up hurting us. For instance, in verse 25, it says, there is a way which seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. And if we're people of prayer, we might be heading down this course of life, submitting it to the Lord, and He just kind of shows us and is like, look where this is going. Look where this is going to take you to. And we realize, this is not a path that's leading to a good place. Maybe it's a relationship that's not heading in the right direction. Maybe it's a business pursuit that's not leading to righteousness. Maybe it's something else that won't lead us to a place where God is being glorified. Well, when God shows that to us, we need to get off that path fast. Sometimes it just might be a slight adjustment in life. Sometimes it might be a major life course correction. But again, it's easier to steer a car that's moving, and when we're submitting to the Lord, when He shows us this path is leading in the wrong direction, let's get back to a path of righteousness. Another thing we have to be always watching out for is our pride. And this is just a decision killer, as we just see in this chapter here. Now, James 4:6 says that God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And if we want God to be opposed to us, let's just be prideful. If we want His grace and His help, let's be humble. And this ties into, if you look at verse 18. Verse 18 is a very commonly quoted verse in the Bible. It's usually misquoted as pride goes before the fall. But here we see it actually says, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before stumbling. But it's the same idea that basically if we're prideful, we're in danger of falling. Now, why is that? And that's because the person who's prideful is not checking the Lord and not seeing, oh, this way ends in death, or not seeing the pitfalls are coming this way. The prideful person doesn't believe there are really any threats they can't overcome. They're relying upon themselves, their own wisdom, their own judgment. They're not submitting things to the Lord. They're perhaps even filtering in unrighteousness into how they're doing things. They don't have God's grace. They don't have His protection, and they're doomed to trip and fall. And so when people begin to rely upon self, they are engaging in pride. Now, what does this look like? Well, in many ways, it's not just a person who's just flat out arrogant, but it's just anyone who is just thinking, well, they can't fall, that they're relying upon themselves, or maybe they're just even focusing on themselves and not really thinking about Christ and how to glorify Him, or maybe they're fearful or they're insecure and they're just trusting themselves. All of that are just different ways of pride being manifested in a person's life, and that kind of thinking leads to a dangerous course of action. And so what we need to do is just prayerfully be bringing all this before the Lord, asking the Lord to crucify ourselves, our own trust in ourselves, our own fear about what we're going to do to mess things on up, and just bring all that before the Lord and let Him lead us and go before us and guide us. Well, as we continue on in chapter 16, another obvious key to making wise decisions is just pursuing wisdom in general. Now, we mentioned from chapter 1 that when wisdom calls out in the streets in chapter 1, she warns that you just can't flip wisdom on like a switch, where you're just pursuing unrighteousness and foolishness all the time, all your life, and suddenly just, I'm just going to be wise today. You can't do that. You're either on the path that pursues wisdom or a path that pursues folly. There is no in between. And so in verse 16 of chapter 16, it says, how much better is it to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding is to be chosen above silver. Down in verse 22, where it says, understanding is a fountain of life to the one who has it, but the discipline of fools is folly. And these verses just continue to show us the value of pursuing biblical wisdom. It's better than gold. It is a fountain of life. And as we pursue it, God will provide it. We see that from James chapter 1. Well, now, how do we know if God is providing us wisdom? Well, a great barometer for wisdom is wise words. Jesus said in Matthew 12:34 that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, and our words reflect our wisdom. So if you look at verse 23 of this chapter, it says, the heart of the wise instructs his mouth and adds persuasiveness to his lips. Basically, when we're wise, we're going to have a wise speech. It's kind of the same idea of Proverbs 15:2, which says the tongue of the wise makes knowledge acceptable. Or down in verse 21 of this chapter here, sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness. Wise words can even be healing to the bones in verse 23. And so we can just see here that a barometer of our wisdom is wise words. But foolish words are the exact opposite. They are just the overflow of a foolish man. And so in verse 27, a foolish person's words are like a scorching fire. In verse 28, he spreads strife and slander among friends. In verse 29, he can even lead people down the path of his folly. And so if we are inciting tensions or spreading slander or tempting people to be led astray from following the Lord, we can be certain that we are not doing something that God is calling us to do. That is a path that we should be repenting of and returning back to a path of righteousness. And so as we wrap up our time together today, I would encourage you to pick one of these Proverbs here and just memorize it. Maybe the ones we covered today or just one of the other ones. There's so many great Proverbs in this chapter, more that we could really cover. But memorize it and letting God then apply that proverb in that wise way into your life. Well, I hope you have a great time memorizing some of these verses for life. We'll catch you tomorrow. Have a great day and God bless.